All right. So, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is July 16th, 2024, and it is about 7:30 p.m. where I'm at right now. About to finish up this book, Is the Turk a White Man, written by Murat Ergin, published in 2018. It's been an excellent read, kind of complicated, very hard in certain parts, covered a lot of history, a lot of ground. I learned a lot while reading this book, and I hope you have too by following along in this series. We only have about half of chapter 6 and the conclusion to read in this book, and I have about 2.5 hours until my English class, so I'll be trying to wrap up and finish this book and not go to part 10 because I really want to get to some more books that are on my reading list and also cover any suggestions that you have for me as well. As for life in Budapest right now, it's been a very cool day. My wife and I went out to the pool. We got videos coming of our travels here in Budapest, us going out to dinner, us going out to eat, seeing new things, doing new things here. So I'll be uploading that on my channel as well, going live talking about the election and other events related to Black life and politics in America and around the world. So stay tuned for all that on my channel as well. But this is an educational platform where I come to learn with y'all. Hopefully you learn from me, and hopefully you can teach me something as well. So jump into the comments and let us know what you think about anything. My guy Avery Adams jumped in here. He said, "Happy Tuesday. My take: the Turk is def a white man." And I hope you're coming to that conclusion, Avery, after following the reading, because let's jump back into the book. In our last reading, essentially, the Turks were heavy into race science, and it was a part of creating their new national identity. And if we think of whiteness as in creating categories of different people, putting whiteness as the pinnacle, associating modernity, contemporary society, advancement, progression, higher intelligence with whiteness, the Turks looked at whiteness the same, and they tried their darndest, they tried their hardest to actually try to claim that title as well. I think the point of whether Turks are white or not is mute. There are Turks that would claim to be white. There are other Turks that would say, no, we're not white. And then there are Turks who would just say, nah. It doesn't matter whether a Turk identifies as white or not. What matters is this: what about their history? What about Turkish society? And what about being white today? What do all of those things have to say about Turkey and its history, right? And this book dispelled the notion that the Turks never thought about race, never thought about whiteness. They're intellectuals, they're educators, they're leaders of creating modern Turkey. We're very obsessed with trying to prove that the Turk was a white man. All right, so let's pick up here on page 210, 211, in the middle of chapter 6, Race in Contemporary Turkey. So it is now time to address two questions regarding the status of race in contemporary Turkey based on the previous conceptual observations. The first question has to do with historical continuities. To what extent can we identify contemporary Turkey as the third snapshot of our collection of racial pictures? That began with the late Ottoman period and continued through the early Republican Turkey. What are the stabilities one can observe across different historical periods as far as race is concerned? And how did racial discourses evolve from early Republican to contemporary Turkey? The second question is more ontological. Given that the concept rarely figures into public discussions, can we still use a race framework to make sense of contemporary culture and identity in Turkey? Following early Republican Turkey, where the term race had a wide circulation, crude race science went out of fashion. Was race merely an aberration from a volatile period that disappeared in the post-World War II Turkey, or does it still operate silently in the cultural domain? Racial discourses in contemporary Turkey display qualitative and quantitative differences from their early Republican counterparts. In previous chapters, we have seen that race played a significant role around the turn of the 20th century and in the interwar period in terms of the formation of Turkish identity and the adoption of Western modernity. Turkish society has experienced significant changes since then. The 1980s witnessed a major process of economic and cultural liberalization. Waves of globalization replaced Turkey's economy's previous domestic focus, which in turn resulted in an ever expanding consumer society. The globally connected consumption ideal of the 1990s changed the urban landscape of Turkey, among other things, in the form of new housing construction, five-star hotels, ethnic and fast food restaurants, and luxury shopping malls. The neoliberal values of the urban middle and upper classes in their secular and pious incarnations acquired broad appeal across different strata. The race science of the 1930s was practiced in a post imperial state by trying to instill Turkishness in the minds of citizens while clinging to the remaining Anatolian heartland after a string of territorial losses. Today, racial discourses circulate in the new urban economy of neoliberalism and the global context of anti racist racism. The silent operation of race in a colorblind world is more difficult than ever to detect. Race has played a formative role in colonial encounters. The historical operation of racial discourses in colonialism and imperialism present us with two starting points that will help us disentangle the Turkish experience: struggles with the West and power. In the 19th century, Ottoman elite were quick to comprehend the links and tensions between race and the West. In the new racial constellation in which the Ottomans had to participate, Western modernity was a jealously guarded prize reserved for those who were seen fit to acquire it. Throughout the Republican and contemporary periods, what remains stable is the struggle with perceiving the West to be a love and hate object. The links between the elusive goal of Westernization and the circulation of racial discourses remain intact throughout the vexed history. In the 1930s, in early Republican Turkey, racial manifestations emerged in direct response to local conditions and needs, but were always in conversation with the image of the West. After all, it was Western audiences that Republican modernizers sought to convince regarding the modernity and whiteness of Turks. Emigre scholars were expected to contribute to the search for essences as experts and arbiters of progress. Today, in a diametrically different country, the image of the West and the images from the West still play a central role in the formation of racial identities. Whiteness still resonates with Turkish identity and maintains its value in the contemporary responses to the image of the terrible Turk. Racial vocabularies had already commanded a large global circulation in early Republican Turkey. The global nature of race science and the movement of scholars across national borders for research and employment are testaments to that. In contemporary Turkey, racial images fasten to global cultural products such as football and popular music, and mix with the already stabilized local understandings of Turkishness. When bananas appear in Istanbul's football fields to taunt black players, a recent phenomenon, globally imported ideas about racial inferiority combined with historically formulated conceptions of Turks' whiteness to form racial discourses that are both old and new. So basically, what he's saying here is that in the post, World War II, end of the Soviet era, end of South African apartheid, end of United States legal apartheid, segregation, and all that sort of stuff, in our neoliberal modern world where everybody in most, modern cities with a population over 1 million, they can go get Indian food, Chinese food. They see different ethnic groups walking around their city. Hell, some of their best friends or romantic partners might be people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds. It's harder and harder to detect race and racism. But because of the prevalence of Western images, Western media, particularly coming from America and also Europe as well, the ideas related to whiteness, race, white supremacy, these things still penetrate into areas all across the world. This is something that I've been thinking about before I even read this book, and he just put it into better words. For example, in Turkey, some black football players go and play in football fields there in football matches, and the Turks throw bananas on the field. Now, that's something that we hear about in Europe when black players in Spain, in Portugal, in Serbia, in Italy, whatever, they're playing, they're beating the hell out of the other team. And so the fans of the other side start taunting the black players by making monkey noises and throwing bananas on the field. This is, tantamount to poor. This is, representative of poor, stupid, ignorant white supremacists in many nations who just feel inferiority to black people. So then they have to portray images or portray acts of superiority to other black people, right? So yeah, it's not surprising that the Turks would be influenced by this because in many parts of the world, We get influenced by different cultures, and other cultures are definitely overly influenced by American and Western media and images and acts and memes. Continuing here. So, power is another key issue that originates both from the colonial origins of racial inequalities and from the inequalities generated within particular local settings. The genetic code of race is imprinted with the search for stable ground for inferiority and superiority. In the Turkish experience, as in the case of other late modernizers, power at the global level links race and modernity, because engaging with Western modernity and its attendant racial imageries takes place under terms defined by the West. The elites in the late Ottoman period made that connection when they imagined modernization as a survival strategy against Western intrusions, and when they fathomed that modernity was a prize reachable only for the racially capable. Thus, one of the defining characteristics of race has been its capacity to form global hierarchies of power, especially through perceived abilities for civilization and modernization. Power and race connect in more local levels as well, as racial identities and ascriptions can shape the life chances of individuals and groups. Perhaps the definition receives a heavier emphasis in Anglo American race scholarship. While social and economic inequalities across racial groups are more real than ever, new and more symbolic forms of racism carries these new power relations into the cultural domain. Racial discourses shape not only life chances, but also cultural desirability and undesirability. While the integration of Turkishness into a global constellation of racial power relations since the late Ottoman period revolves around global hierarchies, the resulting racial discourses around whiteness and modernity of Turks create locally modified cultural hierarchies that shape life chances. In the neoliberal economy of contemporary Turkey, rewards for physical signs of whiteness are numerous. Westernization, done in the name of fighting against racial stereotypes, which denigrated Turks as savage, quote unquote, terrible Turks, resulted in the adoption of a set of values which included racial inferiority and superiority. Essential components of Americanization, cultural infusion of values of consumption, competition, and individualism included racism and reinforced what already existed in the Turkish imagination. The links between race and modernity associate physical appearance and cultural capital in undeniable ways. Once again, guys, if you go to Turkey, you'll notice how they fall over themselves for blonde hair, blue eyed people. And the Turks have a saying, when I was young, I once was blonde. Now, it is true that many Turks, when they are younger, have lighter colored hair. But they say, when I was young, I used to be blonde in a lamenting way, as if they're sad that they lost their Eurocentric features to some degree. Continuing here. Critical race scholarship addresses everyday invisible racisms. Race matters in people's life chances, access to resources, and the formation of hierarchies. Yet it is not unusual to see contemporary racial discourses use colorblind rhetoric. Since contemporary racism denies its existence, scholarship on racism may be problematic in many contexts. Essed and Kwame discusses several issues in the Dutch context. Race, they argue, may easily be associated with the US and UK, leading to the charges of imposing a foreign concept because of concerns for political correctness. Furthermore, while research on ethnic minorities surge largely around paradigms of assimilation and integration, racial exclusions and discourses are silenced in the scholarly literature. Similar observations can be made in the Turkish context. Even if race is accepted as a legitimate field of study, its domains seem limited to overt and individual forms of racism. Race rarely figures in popular debates, while ethnicity and ethnic difference appears frequently in public discussions as the safe choice. The use of race and related concepts are seen as the national character of Turkey and its people's hospitality. The rejection of race and racism takes place at the gut level in terms of generalizations, such as we cannot be racist, rather than empirical analysis. Difficulties against the study of race and racism cut out important tasks for critical race scholarship. The first task has to do with uncovering the silent operation of new racism while still maintaining a degree of consistency to the concept of race. This requires a debate about the linkages between race and related concepts, such as ethnicity and nation, while identifying differences and doing all of this without disregarding experiences of non-US and non-UK contexts. Second, it is important to pay attention to the global nature of race and the fascination of racial discourses with immutability. Attention to power, especially in forms manifested in global inequalities embedded in various modernizations, should bring a due emphasis on the central concern of race and racism in immutable classifications of inferior and superior. Global hierarchies emerging from colonial and post colonial encounters give race a common language. Race scholarship can fight parochialism by pursuing this global agenda. However, this is the third challenge. The emphasis on global linkages needs to be matched with due attention to the local and historical mutations of the concept. Racial discourses change across time and space. Shared origins do not necessarily result in similar destinations. The Turkish case is a testament to these observations. First, the contemporary manifestations of race operate silently and continuously deny their existence. This is different from other over this is different from the over operation of racial discourse in the early Republican period. Therefore, the task of uncovering the silent operations of racial discourses remains ever more important. Second, the formation of racial understandings of Turkishness takes place in a context of global connections, be it the flow of the literature of race science or the movement of individual scholars. The image of the West has always been at the center of the Turkish experience with race. Third, race in the Turkish context emerged intertwined with the historically formed local concerns with modernization. While racial discourses in Turkey are continuously fed with global flows, race science in early Republican era and global culture today, they mix and match with the particular agendas of the local setting. In an attempt to pay attention to historical variation, I will use the term chromatism to identify contemporary racial discourses in Turkey and to distinguish them from early Republican version of race science in service of national modernization. Chromatism suggests an overarching fascination with physical markers of otherness, including skin color, in a country deeply integrated into global cultural flows. Race and chromatism in the Turkish context have overlaps and can perhaps be used interchangeably without doing too much intellectual damage. Chromatic views, like race, emphasize immutability and essential differences between groups. Although chromatism marks a number of subtleties that may identify particular features of contemporary Turkey's experiences with race, it reveals a number of significant differences from the early Republican paradigm. First, visible race talk in chromatism is limited to a minimum. Racial, historical, and linguistic discourses around Turkish identity form a complex picture that is fascinated by immutability and physical appearance, yet vehemently denies its existence. Thus, chromatism refers to race in the absence of race. In both late Ottoman and early Republican periods, racial discourse grew in the intellectual habit of academic theories that intended to classify human populations into scientifically meaningful clusters. Chromatism lacks the pseudo-scientific pretensions of racially constructed views of human difference. When pressed, chromatism may agree to the fundamental equality of each human being, although the subterranean fascination with physical difference will remain. Chromatism rejects any kind of association with race. Its constant search for self-rejection signals an attitude of inclusiveness in the face of actual exclusiveness. While early Republican Turkey engaged in a scientifically driven search for Turkish essences, what is left from this pursuit in contemporary Turkey is a motley assortment of perceptions, views, ideas, and discourses that form the common sense fascination with physical appearances. Second, unlike Republican race science, chromatism is not the ruling paradigm. The former was not the only discourse, and it had to deal with challenges to racial visions and identity formation. It was, however, the dominant paradigm, and it was disseminated in education and public forums with the heavy-handed support of the government. Several examples in this book shows us that the challenging race science was seen as an attack on Turkish identity and modernization. Race played one of the essential roles in the creating a Turkish identity with one foot securely placed in Western modernity, thus challenging this formative discourse. Although possible, took its toll on dissenters. Contemporary chromatism, on the other hand, shows its head in a colorblind world which avoids race talk as an unnecessary complication. The persistence of race remains possible in the cultural domain, which is the third distinction from early Republican race science. Republican race science invested heavily in cultural difference with its emphasis on the racial ability to modernize. Chromatism picks up the thing, extending and deepening the links between appearance and cultural difference while doing away with most explicit references to race. The fourth difference has to do with who gets to be marked by racial discourses. Republican race science was mainly a project of self-assertion of superiority. It claimed whiteness and modernity for Turks while keeping gestures of inferiority toward racial others, such as Arabs, in a relatively subdued state. Assigning others to racial categories was only a byproduct of racial assertions of Turks' whiteness. Chromatism keeps these origins of self-assertion in the background, turning its emphasis to marking others into racially designed inferior cultural categories. The receivers of racial classification vary from African immigrants to the culturally uncouth, and from the Kurdish minority to black professional football players. So basically, what they're saying is like, in the past, the Republicans were focused a lot on race science, like cutting open skulls, measuring bridges on noses to define race and that sort of stuff. Nowadays, like in many parts of the world, Turkey, they're not focused on, the racial science of it, but they are left with some ideas about who is more close to modern, who is more close to civilization, who is more close to actual human progress by the features that somebody has, which is, looking to your left, looking to your right. Do we look white? Yes. So, yeah, by looking white, we are closer to modernity. We're closer to civilization. And notice that the chromatism that they use, the way that they, think about features and texturism and all that sort of stuff, it never relates to any of the other white minorities who are within Turkey. There are tons of Russians there. There are tons of Ukrainians there. There are tons of other Eastern Europeans who live in Turkey. But the people who are designated as racially inferior and culturally backward are the African immigrants, the Kurdish minority, and et cetera, et cetera. So you get what I'm saying? That's what they're talking about here. So continuing here. So chromatism has a number of characteristics that guide my analysis in the following sections. Chromatism as narrative. Chromatism tells stories. The reality of narratives stem not only from the fact that they are never complete fabrications with no correspondence to real or imagined past, but also from the fact that they serve as concrete organizing principles of social life. They classify knowledge into categories of acceptable and unacceptable, speakable and unspeakable, and at the most basic level, existing and non-existing. The story of Turkishness has all too frequently been told as one of the elite fabrication, or as one of elite fabrication. One cannot, however, understand the nature of the Republican past, even its claims to a fracture or a radical break from the past, without seeing how connections with the past haunt the present. Inconsistencies within the narrative structure of chromatism enable us to see that stories are not simply elite fabrications. On the contrary, inconsistencies make racial ideologies more successful and adaptive. Chromatism as everyday practice. A story is never only a story. It affects the ways social actors act. For example, we know that early Republican claims of legal citizenship and unity of the nation coexisted with acts of exclusion. Similarly, the insistent denial of wrongdoing and racial accounts needs to be supplanted with a view that considers narratives as practices, even when narratives deny their own existence. The self-denial of racism in the contemporary world is a practice of normalizing its consequences. When studying chromatic narratives in contemporary Turkey, we also need to pay attention to their consequences. This chapter will do this by taking glimpses into the everyday life of experiences of those who stick out of the crowd, mainly African immigrants. Historical understanding of chromatism. Although I mainly use chromatism in the context of contemporary Turkey, the historical roots of the term should not be neglected. Past inclusions and exclusions, as well as discursive constructions, build contemporary practice of chromatism in terms of both continuities and discontinuities. The experiences of African immigrants, for example, are formed in the face of a historically entrenched idea about the whiteness of Turks supplanted by contemporary global images of race. Everyday fascination with blackness has its roots in Republican attempts to establish the whiteness and the ancientness of Turkishness. To some degree, I disagree with that. I mean, if the Turks are also fascinated by, Africans or black people, I think there also might be, some American influence in there as well, because, black Americans have had the most influence on the world in terms of, putting out images of black people, positive or negative. Continuing here. Global understanding of chromatism. While chromatism has historical roots, it also is a consequence of a globalizing world. While chromatism has historical roots, it also is a consequence of a globalizing world where Western images of race and racial difference easily cross borders and transplant themselves in local contexts. While early Republican discourses provide the historical link for chromatism in contemporary Turkey, constant bombardment of popular cultural images, for example, in the form of Hollywood films and hip hop video clips, deliver the global links. In fact, even the historical formation of Republican racial discourses was a global affair. Previous chapters showed numerous linkages between Western and between Turkish Republican ideas and individuals. The relationship between Turkey and the West was not one way. Western nationalism needed the Eastern or the terrible Turk to accomplish its self definition, while Turkish nationalism built its self definition on its perceptions of the West. Only a truly global understanding of chromatism provides the conceptual tools for an understanding of the contemporary that is both historically formed and genuinely new. In the following sections, I will examine the operation of race and whiteness in three fronts. The first section will investigate how a racialized sense of immutability has penetrated into Turkish self perceptions. Second, using media accounts and secondary sources, I will explore public debates in terms of a broad array of issues ranging from soccer to consumption. Third, studying the accounts of racially marked others, I will consider how race can act as a burden in the everyday life encounters of those whose appearance is marked as different in the chromatic economy of contemporary Turkey. Each section is an attempt to make race visible in a distinct discursive domain. The acute denial of race and racism is a global reality, and Turkish society is no exception to that. As Pinar Batur Vanderlip explains, I grew up in Turkey. The official discourse, revealed in newspapers, textbooks, and class discussions, even voiced by my family, has always been denial of racism in Turkey. Textbooks concluded that racism came to an end with the Nuremberg trials. Overt and covert acts of racism, including discrimination, harassment, or other destructive treatment of minorities, are not confronted by the state. Subtle expressions of racism permeating everyday imagination through cultural icons are not frowned on. Interesting. Interesting. I don't know who Pinar Batur Vanderlip is. Is he a black person who grew up in Turkey? Pinar. That's a very interesting name. It might be African. Pinar Batur Vanderlip. Pinar Batur Vanderlip. Let's see who this was. All right. Pinar Batur Vanderlip. Okay. Pinar Batur looks like a white woman. Looks like a white woman. Either way, there's nothing wrong with a white woman saying that, racism is not spoken about in our society and that's a problem. She seems to be a scholar because she seems to be working at Vassar College. Okay. Either way, continuing here. Continuing here in the story. So, the increasing public contamination of race and racism draws on anecdotal evidence, as in, we cannot be racist. What is striking in such pronouncements is their absolute confidence, marked with the pervasiveness of logical statements and the absence of empirical questions. Race denying defenses never employ, we are not racist, or we have never been racist, statements that, in their empirical nature, may draw one's attention to look into the historical record as well as contemporary practices. The argument around the logical impossibility of race in the Turkish context, epitomized by "we cannot be racist," tends to frame racial discourses as foreign objects irrelevant for Turkish history and lives. This is why, first and foremost, we need to get rid of the word race or racism when talking about the issue, because really what he's trying to talk about is like, there's no way that African immigrants or black people in Turkey can be bothered, harassed, hurt in Turkish society, because race is not a concept here, brother. We do not see race, brother. Race is not real in Turkey, brother. That's what they're going to say. But we need to use the term anti-blackness. Anti-blackness. Is Turkey anti-black? Yes. Is there anti-blackness there? Yes. Is anti-blackness in all societies? Yes. All right, continuing here. All right, the argument around the logical impossibility of race in the Turkish context, epitomized by, quote unquote, "we cannot be racist," tends to frame racial discourses as foreign objects, irrelevant for Turkish history and lives. Nevertheless, race has never been irrelevant, neither when the term was freely circulating in early Republican Turkey, nor when it is conspicuously absent today. Previous chapters in this book argued how essential race was in Turkish modernization. The goal now is to show how it operates in identity issues, popular culture, and everyday life. Racial discourses manufacture a perception of immutability deeply embedded in Turkish identity, a chromatic fascination with whiteness, and a circulation in everyday life, microaggressions in the presence of racially marked others. In illustrating the first front of contemporary race in Turkey, I will use debates in citizenship and belonging to examine how a racialized sense of immutability has penetrated into Turkish self-perceptions. The second domain explores bodies and their physical capital, and a broad array of issues that have to do with culture and consumption. Third, by studying the accounts of racially marked others, I consider how race can act as a burden in everyday life encounters. On all three fronts, we will see that contemporary chromatism builds upon early Republican theories of race and whiteness, but interacts with globally floating signifiers of race and whiteness. While the historical formation of Turkishness still haunts contemporary understandings of race, everyday encounters and debates take place under the bombardment of globally circulating racial conceptions. Batur Vanderlip observes, referring to Churchill and James, 1992, Churchill argued that in the United States, racism's domination of imagination is so complete that even Indian children want to be cowboys. In Turkey, the racist icons of Americanization were so pervasive that even Turkish children preferred to be cowboys. We need to foster frames of understanding that both link Indian and Turkish children wanting to be cowboys and appreciate how contextually distinct these experiences are. Interesting. Very, very interesting quote. Once again, the whole world wants to be cowboys. This might seem Amerocentric for me, but I think we as Americans don't understand how big our culture is, and also how much the world borrows from us, good and bad, about through our media, through our culture, through everything that we sort of put out in the world. I was in Hungary. I went to the pool today. Got called nigger a few times today. It didn't talk about it. Didn't mention it. Didn't make a video about it or anything. Let it roll off my back. Most of them were kids. Young kids. Felt like smacking a few, but I didn't. You get what I'm saying? Because once again, the fault of this has to be on America for doing this, on the ignorance of people, and I have to be black excellent as well. But there is extreme amount of anti-blackness here in Hungary, as I've demonstrated here in my videos, and as I will continue to talk about in my videos here, documenting my life and times. So continuing here, immutability of Turkish identity. One of the pillars of racial thinking in Turkey is the immutability of Turkish identity. The identifying traits in immutable accounts can be positive or negative, but everyday conversations are full of allusions to the idea that one acts, feels, or looks in a certain way because of being a Turk. Turkish identity, in this view, appears to be a timeless and spaceless entity, with an overwhelming and unchanging presence in one's life, remaining in the background, operating along taken for granted assumptions, only raising its head to be contemplated in moments that require comparison with internal and external others. The chromatic fascination with physical appearance, coupled with the idea of the immutability of Turkishness, adds a dimension that go beyond imaginings that mark Turkishness along cultural commonality or ethnic descent. In the face of tremendous diversity, the imagery of a monolithic and immutable Turkish identity persists. The section will trace the racialized immutability of Turkishness in a number of venues, including education, the media, and sports. Sorry, I feel the sneezes coming on again. So, mass education plays an important role in the propagation of nationalist, ethnic, and racial myths. Although some industrialized countries witnessed the eclipse of nationalist paradigms in textbooks, recent reforms in Turkey address nationalism in textbooks. However, their success was limited. Thus, since its inception, the Republican government in Turkey paid utmost attention to the ideological makeup of textbooks in order to make sure that nationalistic values were inculcated and reinforced in each generation. Since the beginning of Republican race scholarship in the 1930s, the Turkish identity presented in textbooks is marked with immutability. The vocabulary of race declined in mass education over time. Islam entered into the textbooks with the Turkish Islamic synthesis of the 1980s, and neoliberal values began to dominate after the 2005 textbook reform. However, the invariability of Turkish identity remained persistent throughout this period. Subtle messages in textbooks, which also endure in popular perceptions and culture today, draw an interminable boundary between non-Turkish citizens who belong and Turkish citizens who do not. Turkey's vexed history with its minorities and the subdued, yet ever alive dream of primordial affinity with external Turks draw a definitive boundary between Turkish identity and citizenship. Minorities offer an effective litmus test to expose the assumptions of immutability in Turkish identity. In addition to subtle and everyday acts of discrimination, distinctions between immutability defined Turks and legally defined Turkish citizenship sometimes permeate the language of the law. The history of the Republic is full of state sponsored acts of discrimination against non Muslim minorities, ranging from the confiscation of the property belonging to minority associations to grossly unfair taxes, resulted in the transfer of wealth from non Muslim minority to Muslim majority. Sneeze break. All right. Recent improvements in the law to recognize and restitute some of the earlier unjust practices were not able to erase decades long cultural perceptions. In public discussions, Freudian slips of the tongue lead government officials to call members of minority groups foreigners, which may also implicitly inflict contemporary legal decisions. Case studies on minority groups also show the limits of belonging available to those who are historically placed outside the boundaries of immutable Turkishness. A striking example is the Donme, a Jewish group forced to convert to Islam during the Ottoman Empire. Despite their centuries old Ottoman and Turkish citizenship, conspiracy theories and popular representations define the group as a secret Jewish society in constant search of power and control. Caught in the double bind, the Donme can neither freely expresses a Jewish identity, which is frowned upon, nor a fully Turkish identity, which is unattainable for them. In direct contradistinction, pardon, in direct contradistinction to minorities who are Turkish citizens but whose belonging to Turkishness is limited, are external groups of Turkic origins whose belonging is more readily consigned despite the absence of citizenship and sometimes linguistic connections. Media and textbook accounts of the Turkic republics in Central Asia tend to convey an immutable brotherhood that goes beyond civic lines. Similarly, people from a Turkish descent are called Turks regardless of their native language or citizenship, indicating that the immutable core remains intact in the face of social change. The rise of German Turkish hip hop group Cartel in the 1990s, for example, was framed by the Turkish media as a testament to the accomplishments of Turkish youth, in complete denial of contextual variations of identities. A more telling comparison of internal/external come from an online newspaper article. The daily newspaper Milliyet reported on its webpage the results of Time magazine's 2008 list of most influential people in the world with the headline, Great Honor, a Turk in the list of most influentials. Clicking on the link reveals that two Turkish citizens made it to the list. The US-born Turkish-American celebrity Dr. Mehmet Oz, also known as Dr. Oz in the United States, and the leader of the Greek Orthodox Church in Istanbul, Patriarch Bartholomew, who was born in Istanbul and is a native Turkish speaker. It turns out that the newspaper's congratulatory remarks were reserved for the former. Implicit and explicit references to the Turkish historical thesis and the Sun language theory linger in textbooks. A major characteristic of historical narratives in both educational and popular renditions is portraying Turkish history as a timeless continuum. The official, quote unquote, narrative from a high school student's perspective, presented in Chapter 2, is a good testament for the sense of history as an endless haze. Textbook accounts discuss a single endless Turkish history, and students are often clueless as to the chronological gaps between events that may be millennia or centuries apart. As Tanil Bora explains in a chapter on nationalism in textbooks, Turks in every epoch of history and in every geography are imagined as being the one and the same political and social subject with present-day Turks of Turkey. Textbooks compress historical time into a monolithic grid under the authority of Ataturk. Ataturk had respect for all nations but saw the Turks as superior to all of them. He believed that there is no nation on earth more grand, pure, and older than the Turkish nation, and that there has never been one either all throughout the history of humanity. All right, KL says, damn, Turkish chicks love us brothers. That's funny because the daughter of Ataturk, Afet Inan, tried her hardest to be white. Afet Inan, Ataturk's adopted stepdaughter, was a blatant white supremacist. Went to Switzerland to study basically anthropology in the white supremacist hue, and came back to Turkey to be a professor, to proclaim that the Turks were white, whites were closer to modernity, and Turks were always a part of the white race, and Turks were also a more superior form of human being than other groups of people. Yeah, I just want to say that. If you're going to say the Turks love brothers, it sounds like reading Turkish history, reading this book here, that the Turks actually were obsessed with whiteness. Continuing here. All right, so Turks in every epoch of history and in every geography are imagined as being the one and the same political and social subject with present-day Turks of Turkey. And continuing here, in some textbooks, outlandish claims parade under the authority of Ataturk. Ataturk had respect for all nations, but saw the Turks as superior to all of them. He believed that there is no nation on earth more grand, pure, and older than the Turkish nation, and that there has never been one either, all through the history of humanity. Textbooks establish a worldview in which societies have certain psychologies and personal characteristics for some historical reasons, which developed and survived with no change at all throughout history. The corollary is the the corollary is the calcification of unexamined statements, as in every Turk is born a soldier. Ugh, gross. Or recurrence of xenophobic tropes assigning any defect with others to their non-Turkishness, as in internal and external enemies. The media does not fare much better in the propagation of immutability. Occasional stories in daily newspapers in support of the long discredited Turkish historical thesis or Sun language theory are disguised as legitimate scientific truths. One story along these lines reports scientific support for Ataturk's Sun language theory, or Turks discovered rodeo. Okay. More frequent are instances of hate speech against internal and external enemies that feed from racial assumptions of immutability. Reports published by watchdog organizations uncover a steady stream of offensive and prejudiced language in major news outlets. In the symbolic cosmology of race and modernity in Turkey, the image of Africa and Africans plays a prominent role. The discursive stability of the belief in Turkish whiteness predicates on identifying Africans as the quintessential other. When people in Turkey are especially enraged about a problem that reflects badly on the country's level of modernity and civilization, they use a popular statement. This, referring to a negative event or observation, would not have happened even in Uganda. Okay. All right, so that's what the Turks like to say. This is so bad, what's happening in Turkey. We should feel bad because this wouldn't even happen in Uganda. Crazy. I know in America we grew up with those racist type statements too. We say, eat your broccoli because there's a starving African child that would love to eat. Or sometimes, if you're old enough, if you're from the 90s, I think if you're from the 90s, my generation, my parents said, you better eat because there's a starving Chinese kid. There's a starving Indian kid. Maybe if you're from the 80s, they would say that's a starving Ethiopian because the Ethiopians were starving in the 80s and stuff like that. I don't know what they're going to say now. Maybe Gen Z kids or Gen Alpha kids, they're being told eat your veggies because you're gonna starve like Kate Moss. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, gonna go here. Worship Black Israelite says, "True that, brother. It's time to spread our powerful Black African genes in Turkish ladies." Okay, some of you are really sick, but what we have been talking about here, is the Turkish intellectuals, preponderance, predisposition, pre predilection. How about this? Predilection to deal in race science. The Turkish intellectuals' predilection to deal with race science. Yeah, continuing here. So, located in popular cultural understandings that are informed by Turkey's long history with the racial perception of modernity, the statement's offensive comparison makes intuitive sense. A problem must be really serious if it does not exist, even in Africa, as the argument goes. A significant domain in which racial imageries erupt in moments of crisis is sports. The globalization of sports in Turkey has especially become a litmus test for racial immutability. Beginning in the 1990s, a large number of foreign athletes started to compete in Turkey in sports ranging from the ever popular football to less visible track and field. Some of these athletes, especially the ones who were born in Africa or the former communist bloc, received an outright racist hostility from the media when they sought Turkish citizenship and participated in national teams. One news story in a national newspaper from 1999, for example, expressed strongly worded concern about track athletes who could not even sing the national anthem. These endeavors to enlist immutability against citizenship target black athletes even more frequently. One of the burden black soccer players carry, for example, has to do with the fact that they are seen as a unitary and stereotypical image of the entire African continent. In his attempt to teach a black player a lesson in civilization, a soccer commenter once said, "This is not Patagonia or another African country." Occasional racial slurs against black soccer players reveal the way in which racial conceptions operate within global flows, in addition to local manifestations of racial legacies. When the president of a football club calls a black player cannibal, or when a Turkish player uses racist epithets against an African player, our attention should not only focus on the local meanings weaved around blackness, but also on how images from global popular culture get into circulation in diverse corners of the world. A more recent incident illustrates the infiltration of racism from European soccer culture into the local views on race. The incident broke out in 2013 in an Istanbul derby match when cameras caught a spectator flashing a banana at one of the opposing team's black players. The incident received intense criticism from some of the foreign players. Yet the club and supporters rejected allegations of racism on familiar assumptions that racism cannot exist in Turkish culture. Although clearly feeding from previous incidents toward black players and from the prevailing images of blackness in Turkey, the banana image itself is novel and hints at a symbolism borrowed from racist discourses in other contexts. So once again, I know people are going to read this book or hear me say this or hear some other intellectual say this, that race cannot that racism exists in Turkey, and even if there was no slavery in Turkey, which there was tons of anti-black racism in Turkey. Even if Turks themselves are dark skinned, which there are black people that will always be darker than Turks. The darkest of Turks is never as dark as the darkest black man, right? Um, these Turks are still borrowing from other cultures, using racial epithets against black soccer players, black people in the streets, referring to them viciously in the media and that sort of stuff. And of course, one of the ways that white supremacy defends itself is by saying that it doesn't exist. Right? There is racism in the world without racist, right? Because nobody is going to admit to being a racist, but many people will continue to do racisms. Continuing here. So, race, culture, and consumption. In 1994, an advertisement campaign for a knitwear company ran in LL, a Turkish women's fashion magazine comparable to Cosmopolitan in coverage and audience. The two-page advertisement portrayed a man wearing the advertised product, a knitted sweater, surrounded by other men who are wrapped in a simple, nondescript yellow cloth. Here is the picture here. All right. Once again, I have to ask: Are Turkish people white? Are Turkish people whites? Looking at this image, I don't know, bruh. Looking at this image, I don't know, bruh. And here are the other guys. This is the image right here. Now, I bet Turkish people got really mad. Turkish people got really mad. That's funny. That's funny. Looking at this picture. Looking at this picture. I don't know, cuz are they white? Anyway, continuing here. I can laugh at that picture all day. I got jokes to say all day, but I won't. Let's run through this book. So, the advertisement repeats a well worn but ironic formula frequently practiced by mass marketed products, conveying a sense of distinction reserved for the consumer of a product and helping them accentuate their individuality at the expense of the indistinct characteristics of the crowd. Despite this banal attempt, the symbolic world of the commercial heavily depends on the accurate reading of the perceptions of physical appearance and its links to cultural capital. These particular characteristics, ranging from hair and eye color to facial hair and height, are used to gauge the cultural worth of individuals in the consumer oriented culture of neoliberal Turkey. The blonde, presumably good looking man wearing the featured product symbolizes the much coveted westernized look. This picture crudely compares him with the mustache wearing, dark haired, and dark skinned crowd. Men who do not have the needed cultural taste to be able to pick the right product. Although the advertisement's reliance on stereotypes generated some controversy, the encoded cultural message could immediately and flawlessly be decoded by anyone exposed to to Turkish cultural debates, regardless of one's personal views on the issue. The creators of the advertisement must have been well aware that their message was transparent enough to reach a large audience. The picture uncovers a symbolic world in which the physical features of the body and cultural capital are combined in consumption habits. A body with physical capital becomes a possessor of power, status, and distinctive symbolic forms, which is integral to the accumulation of various resources. Let's break this picture down. Now, if this picture were taken in America, where you had a bunch of black men wearing, what looks like low-key prison uniforms, right? Because they're kind of orange, in the light, that sort of stuff. Bunch of black men looking dour and sad, and then you had a white man here in a fancy-looking Coogee sweater. Black people will be up in arms. That company would be forced to take down the ad. They'd apologize, blah blah blah. Donate to Black Lives Matter. The world would move on, right? If this advertisement were done in Turkey with a black man wearing the sexy Coogee sweater, and all the Turks were looking dour and depressed, and the black man was handsome wearing the sweater, Turks will be up in arms. How dare you do this? Why would you make this, black man look good in front of all of us? This is Turkey. We need to have Turks represented in media. Why are you doing this? You're causing division and racism. Why are you putting this wokeness in our face? All sorts of $1 million talking points. All sorts of talking points will fall out of the sky, right? This image of a white man outshining the Turks did not cause any controversy in their country. Why? Because the Turks worship whiteness. The Turks worship whiteness, and they see themselves, their fathers, their uncles, their brothers, their sons, their nephews. They see them getting outshined by the white man and say, how can I be like the white man? Now, let's keep it real. This guy could be a Turk as well, because there are Turkish people that do look really, really white. There are Turks that look really, really white. But this advertisement explicitly chose the people with the most Turkish-looking features here. Mustache, black hair, black eyes, olive-colored skin, and then you pick the whitest Turk possible to wear the sweater, right? Turks would see this and say, yeah, that's okay. You can continue to outshine us white men. That's because, once again, they worship whiteness. They find this as aspirational. Anything the white man does in the Turk's eyes is okay, even if it's denigrating to them. We saw, when we read the book yesterday, that Turks were inviting scholars from Europe to try to teach in Turkey, to bring them modernity, and the Europeans who were coming there to teach basically said, yeah, the Turks are backward, stupid, yellow men, and they will never be modern. But the Turks were like, we have white people around us. We are at least good. We are modern. Yes, we are modern. We have all the Jewish scholars from Germany teaching us. You get what I'm saying? This is the thing. This is the thing. The Turks are white obsessed. And so are Turkish people white? Yes, they're white. Because a lot of white people are white obsessed. I don't know. I don't care if they are white or not. That's not the point. The point is of this book is, why are the Turks obsessed with white? Why would they allow this magazine to print something like this in their country and there not be uproar about it? But they have enough time in the world to insult black African soccer players who come to their country to make them richer. Continuing here. All right. Linking cultural modernization encoded as an innate ability and physical markers of distinction is nothing new. The tropes of Turks surprisingly look like Europeans, stubbornly adorn Turkish modernization throughout its development. Early Republican mobilizations around race science increased the attention to physical features as a testament to the innate ability for modernization. A striking example appears in Arnold Toynbee and Kenneth Kirkwood's book, Turkey, published in 1927. Although it made its appearance earlier in this book, this striking quote, intended to be a positive account of the new Republican regime by a sympathetic Westerner, illustrates continuities in terms of perceptions, of chromatic resemblances from Republican to contemporary Turkey, and deserves to be cited again. Accordingly, he, the Westerner, receives a shock when his Turk turns out to be a white man, indistinguishable in figures, features, color, and continents from a native of Transalpine Europe. No doubt, many readers of this book will have seen pictures of Mustafa Kemal and have wondered whether, in physical appearance, the president of the Turkish Republic was typical of his nation. The answer is in the affirmative. The blonde, gray-eyed, fair-skinned, straight-nosed type of Alpine or even Nordic physique is perhaps more common among the Turks than the brunette Mediterranean, and it completely prevails over the Mongoloid type, which in contemporary Turkey is rare, though it does occur in the interior of Anatolia. Once again, that's not even true. Walking around Turkey, yes, there are some blonde hair, blue eyed, straight nose, high cheekbone people, but a lot of them look like these guys. A lot of them look like these guys. A lot of them look like Acti. So, yeah, no. All right, let's keep it a buck. All right, the concepts of Turkish look and European look materialize out of an endless spiral of dialectical encounters between Western perceptions of racialized appearance and Turkish responses to racial discourses around modernity. To emphasize chromatic continuities, I will recite another passage, this time from Selma Ekrem, a granddaughter of Ottoman nationalist poet Namik Kemal. Her memoirs, entitled Unveiled, The Autobiography of a Turkish Girl, and published in 1931, includes observations about her immigration to the United States. In 1923, Ekrem explains, "No one believed that I was a Turk. The same astonishment followed in every place. I could not be a Turk. I was not the type. And when I asked what the type was, the Americans seemed lost to answer me. Some said they thought all the Turks had black hair and black eyes, and I, being fair, could not be a real Turk. Surely I must be mistaken, and then I realized why no one believed me. Here in America lived a legend made of blood and thunder. The terrible Turk ruled the minds of the Americans, a huge person with fierce black eyes and bushy eyebrows, carrying daggers covered with blood. I did not fit into the legend of the terrible Turk, and so I was not one. In fact, many people were disappointed to meet a real Turk who turns out to be fair, meek, and not very unlike an American. Whiteness is disproportionately rewarded in diverse settings across the world. For example, the pattern in which light complexion and its associated characteristics are paid attention to applies to ethnic and racial groups in the United States, India, Japan, Latin America, or Germany. As Alistair Bonnet observes, European social and economic paradigms were connoted through the symbols of race, symbols that gave capitalist incursion and modernity a European and hence white identity. It follows that the history of this era may benefit from the consideration of the relationship between whiteness and modernity more specifically, that any understanding of the interpretation or translation of Western modernity into different cultures around the world demands an understanding of these cultures' adoption and adaptation of notions of racial whiteness. In contemporary Turkey, consumption practices constitute one of the central domains in which chromatism and Western modernity intersect. Dialectical encounters and clashes between globally circulating images of the West, Turkish perceptions of Western modernity, and the local assessment of Western perceptions of Turks all take place within the cultural dynamics of consumption. The affinity established by race and modernity in early Republican Turkey was no doubt a project of government. The biometric mobilization in the 1930s marks a period in which Michael Foucault, identified as biopower, began to shape the government's attempt to align with modern nations. Individuals became countable objects representing the population's innate ability to modernize, but that ability had to be harvested through modern means, regulating reproductive practices in public health or improving hereditary characteristics and increasing population size were seen as necessary steps for modern governing. Bodies were intimately connected to the project of modernization through governmentality. However, one also needs to remember how Anthony Giddens criticizes Foucault's biopower as a one dimensional collection of techniques for controlling bodies and populations. Modern societies, Foucault says, in specific contrast to the pre modern world, depend upon the generating of biopower. Yet, this at most a half truth. The body becomes a focus of administrative power, to be sure, but more than this, it becomes a visible carrier of self identity and is increasingly integrated into lifestyle decisions, which an individual makes. The significance of bodies goes beyond the concerns of governmentality, as they are intertwined with considerations of cultural capital, consumption, taste, and manners, and with taxonomic schemes that place individuals and groups into those who are civilized and those who are not. Once bodies are embedded in consumption choices to reflect taste and lifestyle, racial frameworks of the past penetrate into contemporary debates around culture and modernity. The relative absence of the overt terminology of race does not make Turkish chromatism or the fascination with skin color and other physical characteristics any less pertinent. Instead, what we see is a case of historical spillovers of racial legacies that get carried into contemporary Turkey and engage with the globally circulating markers of cultural and physical distinction. The period of economic, cultural, and political liberalization in the aftermath of the 1980 military intervention proved to be an important turning point in shaping contemporary Turkey. The decade marks the end of economic policies of import substitution and protectionism, and a decisive turn toward neoliberalism, market economy, and globalization. The end of military rule in 1983 witnessed the return of multi party politics and increasing participation from different sectors of society. The explosion of the tourism industry, the proliferation of five-star hotels, the spread of modern means of transportation and telecommunication, such as the internet, cell phones, and satellite TV, and the rise in the number of Turkish students seeking education abroad were just a few symptoms and avenues of the intensifying global flows, as well as deepening effects of capitalist relations. A major consequence of Turkey's transformation in the post 1980 period was the materialization of new urban middle classes in search of cultural distinction. Members of the new middle classes consisted of urban entrepreneurial and professional groups occupying powerful positions in the economic hierarchy of Turkish society. These new urban elites cling to cultural distinction through patterns of consumption relatively novel to Turkish society. They pursue a new lifestyle in gated communities in the newly developing suburbs of major cities. Their domestic chores, such as cooking, house cleaning, childcare, and gardening, are to a great extent taken over by informally employed members of the poorer segments of urban population. They shop in secure and sterile shopping malls, which have started to dominate the urban fabric of large cities in recent years. Their children receive education in elite private institutions. These and other cultural markers have begun to define middle class identities in an endless quest for distinction from other urban dwellers. In this sense, the new urban elites not only attempt to leave behind the putative incivility of city centers, but in fact also produce the idea of a stereotyped group of uncivilized individuals whose existence justifies their efforts of distinction and segregation. In earlier chapters, we saw how the links between whiteness and modernity emerged and operated. This fascinating combination of race and culture lays the groundwork in contemporary Turkey for peculiar attempts to claim cultural capital in the conditions of a global neoliberal world. Cultural distinction in Turkish urban settings represents the ability to feel at home in the modern world and is manifested in the field of consumption practices and physical characteristics ranging from skin color to facial hair. Although it is always subject to competing definitions and fluctuating interpretations, modernity operates as a symbolic anchor in this equation. Being modern on one hand implies that a person's lifestyle, taste, and status reflect high levels of cultural capital. On the other hand, accumulating the necessary cultural capital and the corresponding identity of a modern individual is reserved for, or at least more readily granted to, those whose identity certain those whose ident- those who display certain physical characteristics. Sorry. On the other hand, accumulating the necessary cultural capital and the corresponding identity of a modern individual is reserved for, or at least more readily granted to, those who display certain physical characteristics. Once again, whiteness does mean something in Turkey because he's describing the new urban elites, the rich people who live in their gated communities and stuff. If you go to Turkey, it's no it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise that the richest, most successful people, the people you see driving the BMWs and the Mercedes, by and large, are the light-skinned Turks, the ones who could really pass for white. A lot of them, of course, get educated abroad, come back to Turkey and ball out of control. Some of them only come for holiday. Some of them have multinational businesses, but a lot of them, by and large, still, even if they're the ones who are emigres coming back, they are white. They are white-looking Turks. It's not a surprise. It's a real thing. All right, continuing here. In other words, replicating a pattern we have observed in early Republican modernization, being modern is reduced to an innate ability reflected in certain physical characteristics, such as light skin and blonde hair. Modernity links a potential represented by physical characteristics and an achievement displayed in cultural distinction. A mismatch between the two appears awkward or funny. Physical characteristics imbued through the lens of cultural hierarchies operates along an electrical collection of symbols and practices organizing everyday life experiences. In this cultural universe, physical appearance maintains a crucial symbolic role in Turkish debates around consumption, lifestyle, and status. A number of ethnographic studies hints at the advantages and cultural distinction a European look confers its possessors in Turkey's globalizing cultural economy. Navarro Yashin's ethnographic study of the Turkish state mentions European looks and blue eyes as central assets in linking identities to modernity in urban encounters. Interactions between prostitutes from former Soviet republics and their clientele in Turkey also reflect the value assigned to whiteness in their contemporary sexual economy. Interesting. Interesting. So, yeah, I think what he's trying to say here is that the blonde haired, blue eyed prostitutes from Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, who flooded into Turkey, they were still viewed as being so beautiful, so gorgeous, so high class, and of high quality because they had the physical distinctions of modernity. Continuing here. In their ethnographic study of northern Black Sea border region of Turkey, Chris Hahn and Ildiko Bellerhan observed, according to this aesthetic, the pale blonde Slav women were much preferred to the darker women from Georgia and Azerbaijan, and they therefore gravitated towards the larger urban centers where they could charge much more money for their services. These women were referred to as Beyaz Rus. Beyaz means white, white Russian. When the term was applied to women from southern Russia or the Ukraine, our initial diagnosis was an error in political geography. We later realized that this conforms to the traditional positive associations of whiteness in Turkish Islamic culture. Tanil Bora considers class racism a characteristic of neoliberal nationalism, defining class racism through the penetration of biological standards, such as light skin color and tall stature, into other markers of class, including education, consumption, and occupation. Furthermore, he states, bragging remarks about an increasingly good looking Turkish population, a common occurrence in the vocabulary of urban cultural distinction, may pave the way for the eugenic tendency of neo racism. Physical characteristics are attached to a large collection of cultural hierarchies, distinguishing traditional from modern, low from high, us from them, and banal from refined. Although these dichotomies are problematic and do not hold up to close social scientific scrutiny, they shape cultural perceptions of social actors. Culture becomes politicized when cultural practices influence people's survival chances in everyday encounters by placing them in hierarchies of modern and traditional, and in turn, locking them into positions in societal level debates, such as the headscarf or the role of Islam in public life. Apparently trivial combinations of cultural practices and objects begin to signify a clash between what is considered the traditional and the modern. For example, people may obsess about whether combining whiskey, representing a dark, quintessentially Western, and lahmacun, a local dish, indicate a culturally inferior position. Careful, careful cultural work is necessary in the detection and maneuvering of boundaries for the establishment of distinction. Accumulating cultural capital involves claiming a share of the mythical modernity, as well as keeping away from combinations of modern and traditional, unless one approaches hybrid combinations ironically and humorously. Cultural representations of modernity struggle to keep the hybridity and ambiguity of everyday life away. When class and status boundaries are penetrated, anxieties lead people to label the invading practices either as traditional in the sense that these practices are something that had to be overcome but is still surviving, or too modern in the sense that they are foreign cultural items invading sacred local domains. So this is a perfect time to mention Louisiana lahmacun. Louisiana lahmacun, my creation. Lahmacun is a Turkish dish with flat bread with basically meat, baked into it on top. You usually roll it up with vegetables inside, maybe sprinkle some lemon juice on it and eat it, right? Louisiana lahmacun is 10 times better. We chop up onions, garlic, tomatoes, cucumbers, whatever you want, mix it all together in oil, sprinkle some cheese all up in it too, spread it over the lahmacun, bake it, and boy, you got yourself a party. Now, that relates to what this guy is talking about here. The thing is, in Turkey, there's once again this constant battle between what is modern and what is traditional. And on some hand, they appreciate so much modern things and the aesthetics of modernism, but they also have traditions that they hold on to, and the traditions are viewed as either being too traditional, yet they still persist. And the same as well with the modernity as well. There are things about modernity that they like and dislike, but a lot of it that they accept, as long as it's coming from the hands of people with the palest skin, the bluest eyes, and the blondest hair. All right, continuing here. Whiteness and bodies capture these cultural tensions. They play a symbolic role in the debates around distinction and cultural boundaries. A key concept that emerged in the 1990s, white Turks, illustrates the links between culture and race in contemporary Turkey. The term, credited to journalist Ufuk Guldemir, originally emerged as a critique of the professional middle classes that enjoyed the economic and cultural privileges of the post 1980 Turkey in newly emerging gated communities. The implicit criticism revolved around a tongue in cheek disbelief at the magnitude of inequalities in a country without races, and deemed the large inequalities seen in Turkey as fit for a system of racial hierarchy. The term was eventually adopted in the media by representatives of the new middle classes for self identification of privilege, and then went into widespread circulation. White Turks identify privileged groups in prestigious white collar occupations, the civilian or military, bureaucracy, business, or media, who have generations of urban background and significant cultural capital. Beyond the socio-economic and cultural connotations of the term lies a terrain of a constellation of bodily markers reflecting the overarching logic of the neoliberal age, which conflates culture with signs of chromatic superiority. The links established between physical markers and cultural distinction led some scholars to call excesses of the post 1980 period white Turk racism. Thus, the whiteness in White Turk refers to a constellation of cultural superiority matched with attendant physical manifestations that could be read by competent decoders of Turkey's contemporary symbolic universe. The blonde man featured in the LL advertisement builds on such a cultural reading to identify cultural and physical markers of distinction. Interesting. The discourses of civilizational superiority and inferiority exhibit the range and complexity of physical and cultural markers employed in everyday encounters. A large portion of debates since the 1990s took place along middle class fears of invasion of cities by uncultured masses. The physical markers of otherness assigned to the invaders include facial hair, especially mustaches, body odor, and dark skin complexion. One of the best, although extreme, examples of white Turk Orientalism would be the journalist Mine G. Kirakinat, whose columns were replete with contempt for the unwelcome residents of cities. Her essays, straddling the 1990s and the 2000s, delved into personal encounters in urban everyday life, describing the masses as people with short legs, long arms, and hairy bodies who resemble Africans or Arabs. Ugh. Another emblematic character was journalist Atagrul Ozkok, known for his acute attention to physical appearance as one of the defining features of a new and successful generation of Turks. Advertisement agencies, too, did not hesitate to invoke this image of cultural and physical superiority to sell products that targeted white Turks. For example, a series of print commercials for the automobile company Audi identified characteristics of individuals that would not be fit to drive their cars. Their commercials, entitled Accessories Never Included in an Audi, included close up shots of body parts with undesirable cultural physical characteristics, such as a foot wearing white socks and dark shoes, and a male hand with visible dark hair and kitschy jewelry. Okay, that's hella racist. But the Turks allow this sort of racism to happen in their own country where they predominate, and they think that's okay, but they feel okay throwing bananas on the football field of black football players. Uh, Amazing. The rise of conservative middle classes, epitomized with the election victories of Islamic inspired AK Party, Justice and Development Party in 2002, 2007, 2011, and 2015, changed not only the economic and political structure of the country, but also the cultural hierarchies established throughout the Republican regime. The White Turk debate also resonated among those who considered themselves as the others of cultural privilege. The Prime Minister, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, was the foremost politician attempting to delve into this critical potential to mobilize large groups for electoral politics. In several speeches, he pronounced his followers and Muslims in Turkey as Turkey's blacks, thus framing the issue as a conflict between the historically privileged secular groups and the increasingly powerful conservative actors from rural origins. Once again, the entire world is obsessed with the black man and our struggle. What the hell? Turkey could have been, what Erdogan was trying to do is say that, we are rising up against the elite urban upper classes who drink vodka and they don't pray and they're taking our country to the West. We are the blacks. We are the blacks who will have a black revolution, black power. You think Recep Tayyip Erdogan stood up in front of the group and said black power in front of his followers? That's crazy. Anyway, in several speeches, he pronounced his followers and Muslims in Turkey as Turkey's blacks, thus framing the issue as a conflict between the historically privileged secular groups and the increasingly powerful conservative actors from rural origins. In this sense, the dichotomy of black and white hints at the cultural aspects of the often politically driven clashes between secularists and Islamists. Whiteness functions as a metaphor to evidence the privileges enjoyed by secular, educated, and urban groups, whereas blackness identifies the conservative groups from rural origins. The color-coded dichotomy is embraced by secular urbanites to establish their distinction and superiority, and by conservatives from the heartland of Anatolia to emphasize the injustices wrought by a long period of top-down modernization. The racial metaphor of whites versus black Turks aptly reflects the fact that decades old debates between seculars and Islamists or modernists and conservatives in Turkish politics have roots in status, class, and cultural distinction. These debates are frequently coded in terms of visible physical markers on bodies. The Prime Minister's remarks hint at the way in which the blacks of the dichotomy see themselves as attempting to resist and reshape this discourse. The urban, rural, and cultured versus clash the urban/rural and cultured versus uncultured dichotomies embedded in the white Turk discourse affect Kurds too. The largest minority in Turkey, Kurds have been increasingly identified with physical markers since the 1990s. For example, the expression Kiro, used in popular culture to refer to Kurds, combines physical and cultural features. A Kiro can stereotypically be identified with clothing, skin tone, and bodily hair. Yet, these outward characteristics are expected to be accompanied by uncouthness and low cultural capital. In fact, the dark-skinned, hairy, and uncouth characters, the bread and butter of popular humor magazines, frequently turn out to be none other than Kurds. Accents operates as a pervasive proxy for racial differences. The White Turk discourse builds a hierarchy of accents and views the so-called Istanbul accent as the central and correct one. The Eastern or Southeastern accents, on the other hand, are identified as inferior accents associated with Kurds, rural lifestyles, and uncultured migrants to cities. A number of venues of humor, ranging from popular comics to comedy shows, identify the accent as a funny indicator of low cultural distinction. Both white Turks and their counterparts, the unrefined crowds of dark Turks, are represented primarily by men. Men are considered to have more power and choice as opposed to women. Thus, men can be blamed for their body images and cultural condition, whereas women are seen as victims of patriarchal ideologies. Race and microaggression in everyday interactions. The daily newspaper, Milliyet, reported a violent incident on its internet page on April 10th, 2014. The news story narrates an attack, dubbed as an odd assault by the headline, on four black Liberian tourists in Istanbul. According to the news story, the assailants yelled, "I don't like black Americans," during the attack. The oddness indicated in the headline is a gesture intended to acknowledge the widespread belief that racism is foreign to Turkey. However, considered in the context of how race matters in the context of Turkish modernity, race-based violence cannot be unusual as implicated in the news story. After all, for some activists, the killing of a Nigerian immigrant, Festus Oke, in an Istanbul police station is the continuation of a pattern of police mistreatment toward African immigrants. While acknowledging the persistent threat of violent encounters with the state, this section will focus on everyday incidents where, in the absence of outright physical violence and the involvement of official agencies, race serves as a stigma to mark individuals in public spaces and cause undue attention. Conceivably, the cumulative effects of everyday aggravations matter in the subjective experiences of racially marked individuals, perhaps even more than physical physical violence, and official sanctions. A survey of 133 African immigrants conducted in 2005 in Istanbul revealed that 49.9% cite lack of income when asked about their biggest problems in Istanbul. What is more striking is the fact that the second most popular complaint is not the discrimination, ill treatment by the police, or housing problems, which are ranked lower on the list, but ill treatment by strangers. This section examines the fleeting and impersonal interactions of racially marked individuals with strangers in urban settings. Within urban settings. Microaggressions are constant and continuing everyday reality of slights, insults, invalidations, and indignities visited upon marginalized groups. What makes them especially dangerous is their invisibility to the offenders. Unlike instances of overt violence, these everyday interactions crystallize taken for granted racial conceptions in the Turkish context and exemplify how transnational flows of racial imageries enmesh with local perceptions. Since 2004, I have conducted unstructured, in depth interviews with 25 non Turkish citizens living in Istanbul under different statuses. For example, English teacher, student, and asylum seeker. All of these individuals consider themselves to be marked in one way or another as different in their appearance. Four are white Europeans, one male and three females. Two are Japanese, one male and one female. Seven are Turkish citizens with African origins, four females and three males. And 12 are African immigrants, seven males and five females. The goal of these interviews was not only to identify racial marginalization in everyday life, I was also interested in uncovering the dominant but concealed category of Turkish whiteness through the accounts of those excluded from it. Members of the majority are more likely to be unaware of microaggressions, as well as the operation of dominant and taken for granted identity categories. However, marginalized individuals are practically forced to face the reality of exclusion in their everyday interactions. Instead of interviewing members of the Turkish majority, I focused on the everyday interactions of racially marginalized individuals with the majority, working on the assumptions that, number one, scholarship on race should not ignore central racial categories, in this case, Turkish identity. Number two, the advantages of whiteness may remain concealed from the dominant racial group. Three, racial others are in a privileged position to gauge the operation of whiteness. Number four, the fleeting interactions with complete strangers allows for a focus on physical appearance while minimizing the effects of personality, class, or country of origin and religion, which may not be accessible in urban encounters. Interview respondents tend to classify the micro encounters with locals into the categories of pleasant and non pleasant. Many adamantly insist that non pleasant incidents should not distract one from the existence of pleasant interactions. The purpose of this section is to uncover the racial perceptions of Turkish locals. Therefore, the pleasant versus non pleasant dichotomy, which understandably matters to the racially marked, will not be embellished. Nevertheless, it is important to emphasize that encounters classified as pleasant may easily contribute to a pattern of undue public attention. For example, a black male respondent reported the story of a mother who approached him in a shopping mall to ask, "What can I do for my kid to be black like you?" Okay, what a stupid thing to say. While the respondent described this as a positive exchange, it also illustrates the publicly marked character of dark skins in Turkey's urban landscape. Does the absurdity of the statement hint at the fact that race, in the case of marked individuals, operates as a communicative bridge hammered to fit into all encounters? Clearly, these experiences will add up to the race fatigue or over attentiveness to race at the expense of all other characteristics repeatedly reported by the respondents. Public responses to racially marked individuals, especially to those seen as blacks, are shaped by ambiguous perceptions of Africa. In general, in a country where foreign news is dominated by what happens in Europe and North America, Africa does not figure into public debates very frequently. When it does, the media portrays the continent mainly through poverty, droughts, and violence. Sympathetic accounts draw upon Africa's status as a victim of Western colonialism. However, the media's focus on Africa as a dark and exotic place replicates replicates colonialist views. African migrants are often associated with crime and drug dealing in media accounts. Furthermore, all these views blend with global images of hypersexual, uncivilized, disease ridden, and exotic Africans. When placed in the context of Turkish self image of whiteness, the result is urban encounters with repetitive microaggressions. As another study notes on Africans' everyday experiences, they were called Zenchi, an offensive term for black Africans. I repeat right here. I repeat right here. Zenchi is an offensive term for black people. Let's make this absolutely clear. A Turkish man said this. A Turkish man said this. So, as another study notes on Africans' everyday experiences, they were called Zenchi, an offensive term for black Africans, laughed at, touched, provoked, and mistreated. Female interlocutors talked about being embarrassed on the streets, indicating verbal sexual insults. As the roots of microaggressions against Africans in public encounters is undue attention, in its positive and negative incarnations, respondents cite stares and physical touches as common occurrences. Clearly, some of these instances will be coded by locals as friendly interest. As representatives of a poor and mistreated continent, black individuals will receive attention that may not be welcome. Similarly, some of the locals may see the term Zenchi as a neutral, if not sympathetic term, although Africans who are subjected to it clearly despise the address. These encounters and exchanges are particularly problematic for the racially marked for two reasons. First, during these rituals of touching, gazing, and prodding, the African subject remains voiceless, only an object of inquiry and curiosity. Second, the cumulative effect of constant attention creates an aversion to public interaction and causes deep scars in a person's psyche. In the process, offensive language and behavior end up being classified as harmless curiosity. Both black and Japanese respondents in my sample reported that completely inappropriate looks, remarks, and touches infantilize them and render them invisible. A male black African respondent explains the exotic interest in his appearance as follows. On the street, I have to go through interviews every day, including by kids. Where are you from? Which country? Which country is better, yours or Turkey? They use words like Zenchi. They laugh at us. This is humiliating and annoying. So, interview on May 28th, 2012. One frequently voiced concern reported by black respondents is questions regarding their cannibalism. After I asked about perceptions of South Africa and Turkey, a black female from South Africa mentioned the image of the cannibal in the following way. When I first came here, I would tell people I'm from South Africa, and they were like, yam, yam, yam. Cannibal, yam, 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 yam. Cannibal in Turkish. I'm like, huh? And this is last year. I didn't know what it was like, yam yam. And then, like, I was teaching kids, and they would all be like pretending as if she were eating her forearms, laughing. And then I discovered that it means cannibal. An African American woman commented on the frequency of the cannibal remark based on her own and others' experiences. I mean, if they think I'm African, they ask me if, I'm a cannibal. If I eat, how's human flesh? How does it taste? It wasn't someone I knew, but somebody on the street. I have a lot of conversations with people when I buy things. I was buying a Salpak paper tissues, actually. He said, "Are you from Africa?" I said, "No, I'm from New York City." Then he asked me about human flesh. And actually, these two girls I live with from South Africa, they get that asked that a lot, as if they eat human flesh and how it tastes. So, racial discourses rarely emerge in isolation. The source of the cannibal image, as well as a large number of misperceptions about blackness in Turkey, has to do with racial images circulating around the globe through Western, mostly American, popular culture. Although deeply informed by Turkey's history of modernization and racial identity formation, the contemporary language of race in Turkey borrows a lot from a diverse mix of popular cultural products, ranging from Hollywood movies to rap videos and soccer games. One female African Turk in my sample told me how his friends call her dirty African or dirty Negro, piss Zenchi. Wow. This odd sounding phrase comes from American films and TV series shown in Turkey. In the absence of a local equivalent, the offensive term Nigger that appears frequently in these popular cultural products is usually translated as piss zenchi. Following a long journey from an entirely different cultural landscape in the U.S. to the Turkish context, the term then becomes a way of bantering among local friends. The remarkable match between the racial stereotypes found in Turkey and the globally circulating racial imageries can be explained by the consumption of Western films, TV dramas, and music videos in the local settings, devoid of their original context. The African American respondents were in a good position to observe how racial images can travel across borders. As a female respondent explains, my theory, laughing, my theory is television, which I consider as one of the greatest evils of modern society, as much as I love it. I have this love hate relationship to television. But I mean, recently I was considering that. Every country I've ever been to had those stereotypes. Everywhere. I mean, you cannot promote that kind of cultural stuff without the mass media coming before. I mean, if you go to a grocery store, the stuff they are watching there is from 1950s. There is that big fat black woman that's still on TV now. That's the kind of thing people still are getting. They watch a few videos, they see a film, and they think they have a grasp of, anyway, in addition to all the stereotypes associated with crime, violence, and drug dealing, global racial images also encompass representations of urban cool associated with African American inner city culture. Humor magazines are quick to pick up on the mismatch between the difficult lives of African immigrants in the streets of Istanbul and the urban hip hop cool attributed to black bodies. For example, a cartoon in popular humor magazines depicts an interaction between a teenager and an African immigrant in Istanbul. The teenager plays a song in the portable music device and asks the African man if he knows about the music of Tupac, Snoop Dogg, and Jay-Z. The immigrant, one of the ubiquitous African street vendor selling fake watches and jewelry all around Turkey, responds by listing a number of Turkish pop singers about whom he knows. The teenager responds, "What kind of Zenchi are you?" Wow, wow, wow. A consequence of the circulation of urban cool, as it is depicted in global popular culture, is the hypersexualization of black bodies. Images and video clips mark black males with insatiable sexual appetites, whereas black women as easy and promiscuous. This sexualized image crosses color lines for women. As black male interviewer from Sudan puts it, I'm sorry to say, all the Turkish men they think are black or other women in Istanbul, it's only to be effed. Wow, they're only there to have sex. They're only there to be prostitutes. That is what I will tell you. Any foreigner woman, any not white or black. Okay. Once again, broken English, but we get the idea. Okay. So, the contemporary transnational images of race circulating in popular culture are only part of the story. The second source of racial perceptions has to do with the Turkish fascination with the links between whiteness and modernity, firmly established in the 1930s. Black skin color can become marked and worthy of attention only when it can be contrasted to whiteness. Thus, the Turkish investment in whiteness that solidified in the formative years of the Republic, in itself a part of the transnational network of race scholarship in the first half of the 19th century, lies at the roots of urban microaggressions in contemporary Turkey. The racial mobilization of that period to establish the whiteness of Turks rendered the category of whiteness central to Turkish self perceptions and evaluations of others. The formation of this racialized identity was done in order to claim modernity with a white identity. As one respondent, a woman from South Africa, observed, local people in Turkey are convinced of their own whiteness. Actually, I had once a Kurdish guy tell me I was sure he was very ignorant. Actually, he was like, "Well, you're mixed," and it's like, I'm like, "What are you? You're mixed too," and he's like, "No, no, I'm white," and like Turks are white. Black people, we have to laugh at the stupidity of white people sometimes. We have to. Anyway. These experiences are not necessarily limited to individuals with darker skin tones. In fact, anyone marked with racial otherness may be subject to undue public attention and microaggressions. In fact, one female black respondent brought up this same issue while comparing her experiences to Asians. I think they, Asians, are pretty worse than I am. I know two Japanese people that work here. The Japanese are seen very amusing. They make a lot of fun Japanese people and Chinese people, even my friends who are more educated or more, I don't know, enlightened, is that a word? They seem to find them hysterical, very amusing. I'm like, they are your cousins, ethnically speaking. You are Asian, but they are treated like, when they speak, they make fun of them to their faces. They think it's hysterical, that kind of thing. But as being respected racially, I'm sure they are probably more respected than I am. Interesting. Religion has a complex relationship with race in more rural settings and can be used as a strategy to breach the perceived color gap and establish a sense of communalism with local Muslims. A black African Muslim, for example, argued that his Muslim name provided undeniable advantages once he started verbal communication with locals. This tendency was especially stronger outside of Istanbul. I've spent 2 years in Izmit. Izmit is a different ball game. People are not as worldly as the people in Istanbul. Istanbul is quite cosmopolitan, especially the center. Izmit is not like that. Izmit was a lot different in terms of people's exposure to foreigners. In Izmit, 7 or 8 out of 10 shopkeepers would ask me, "Where are you from?" They're very interested in foreigners because not many foreigners come to Izmit. So everyone would ask me, "Where are you from?" And then the interesting response, "Oh, Africa," as if Africa is a country. Question number 2 will be either what's your name or are you Muslim? I would say, well, my name is Ahmad, and they would be, oh wow, someone with a Turkish sounding name, and they like that. Immediately invokes this cordial feelings. Oh wow, he is one of us. Kardashim, my brother. Okay, interesting. So, if religion is important in certain contexts to ease racial tensions, could the root of the ill treatment of the racially marginalized be their foreignness? An interesting test case is African Turks. Finally, to the African Turks. We got this far in the book without talking about the Afro Turks, the descendants of slaves in Turkey. Continuing here. This group consists of the descendants of African slaves brought to the Ottoman Empire centuries ago. They are Turkish citizens, native Turkish speakers, and Muslims. In 7 interviews I conducted with them, the effects of skin color were clear in their impersonal public interactions. African Turks report repeated instances of people showing disbelief upon hearing their fluent Turkish. They are considered to be foreigners, as Turks are considered to be whites. Also, a mix of positive, exotic interest and negative harassment on the street treatments are reported. In this sense, the experiences of African immigrants and African Turks are not qualitatively different. The difficulty African Turks face in convincing others of their Turkishness is a testament to the fact that the assumptions of Turkish whiteness go beyond linguistic and religious considerations. Even the fact that they are native speakers of Turkish can lead to microaggressions because African Turks reported to regularly hear, "Where did you learn Turkish?" The same respondent also narrated the story of his visit to Germany and how he was able to convince both the Turkish and the German passport police that he was a proper Turk only after hours of detention. Wow. Similar to African Turks, white Africans cause confusion with regard to racial assumptions. People in Turkey tend to associate Africa with blackness. A white African female indicated that as soon as people hear that she is of African descent, they look at me and they say, "You can't be, you're white." For her, problems start when she appears on the streets with black Africans. I think when I'm by myself, I'm okay. People don't often realize I'm a foreigner because I've got dark hair, but as soon as I'm with her black African friends, it immediately changes me into a foreigner. Then it's fair game. It's like I'm still the same person. Kind of like they might respect me more than what they do to her. I mean, I don't know if that is purely chance, but it just happened too many times. Then you could think that is purely chance. So interviews indicate that not only do the racial ghosts of the past, but also the flow of contemporary global culture contribute to the formation of racial discourses in Turkey today. While the integration of Turkishness into a global constellation of racial power relations since the late Ottoman period revolves around global hierarchies, the resulting racial discourses around the whiteness and modernity of Turks create locally manufactured cultural hierarchies that shape life chances. Very, very interesting stuff. Very interesting stuff here. You think I can get through chapter 7, the conclusion? Let's see. How many pages in the chapter 7 in the conclusion? Oh, wait. This is 239, 240. That's it. Only 2 more pages, and then we're done with the book. Why not? Let's blow through chapter 7 in conclusion. So, conclusion, we're wrapping up our book, Is the Turk a White Man? This is the final live stream for this book. It's been a long journey. At the end of this, I'm going to take off this headband and you're going to see that I'm really white. You're going to see I'm really a Turk, nigga. As soon as I finish this book, it's going to be Marhaban, bitch. Where's the Iran hoe? That's what it's about to be. But let's finish up this book right here, right here, right here. Let's go. So, chapter 7, conclusion. Race has played a formative role in colonial encounters. Colonial encounters took place in a variety of contexts, and considering the Turkish case under this light adds further complexity and nebulousness to the picture. The historical operation of racial discourses in colonialism and imperialism offers two apertures that offer promise to disentangle the Turkish experience. The first lens has to do with a familiar theme, the centrality of the West in the formation of Turkish identity, the familiar ground of modern habitual perceptions of modernizers and their visions of the West. To put it more bluntly, a history of Turkey's modernization cannot be written without taking race seriously. In the 19th century, Ottoman elites were quick to comprehend the links and tensions between race and Western domination. In the new racial constellation in which the Ottomans found themselves, Western modernity was a jealously guarded prize reserved for those who were seen racially fit to acquire it. In early Republican and contemporary Turkey, the West, seen as a symbol of love and hate, remained central. The links between the elusive goal of Westernization and the circulation of racial discourses remained intact throughout this vexed history. In the 1930s and early Republican Turkey, racial manifestations emerged in direct response to local conditions and needs, but were always in conversation with the West, both in terms of the movement of ideas and of individual scholars. After all, it was Western audiences that Republican modernizers sought to convince regarding the modernity and whiteness of Turks. Emigre scholars were expected to contribute to the search for essences as experts and arbiters of progress. Today, in a diametrically different country, the image of the West and the images from the West still play a central role in the formation of racial identities. Whiteness still resonates with Turkish identity and maintains its value in contemporary responses to the image of the terrible Turk. Racial vocabularies already commanded a large global circulation in early Republican Turkey. The global nature of race science and the movement of scholars across national borders for scholarship and employment are testaments to that. The Ottoman and the early Republican periods are now history. Perceptions of Turks as subhuman, bloodthirsty, and terrible creatures are contested, and the new currents of immigrants across the globe continuously expose rigid national and ethno-racial identities to tough questions. Contemporary Turkey confronts its heterogeneity. In moments of rupture, the taken for granted notions of essential cultural and national identities erupt into public discourse and regenerate naturalized cultural and national boundaries. Today, racial images fasten to global cultural products such as football and popular music and mix with the already stabilized local understandings of Turkishness. When bananas manifest in Istanbul's football fields to taunt black football players, the globally imported ideas about racial inferiority combine with historically formulated conceptions of Turks' whiteness to form racial discourses that are both old and new. Power is another key issue that originates both from the colonial origins of racial inequalities and from the inequalities generated within particular local settings. The genetic code of race is imprinted with the search for stable ground for inferiority and superiority. In the Turkish experience, as in the case of other late modernizers, power at the global level links race and modernity, because engaging with Western modernity and its attendant racial imageries takes place under terms defined by the West and places an imagined West in the center as the audience and arbiter of modernization. Modernizing elites in Turkey made that connection, but when they imagined modernization as a survival strategy against Western intrusions, and when they fathomed that modernity was a prize reachable only for the racially capable. Thus, one of the defining characteristics of race has been its capacity to form global hierarchies of power, especially through perceived abilities for civilization and modernization. Power and race connect in more local levels as well, when racial identities and ascriptions shape the life chances of individuals and groups. While social and economic inequalities across racial groups are more real than ever, new and more symbolic forms of racism carry these power relations into the cultural domain. Racial discourses not only shape life chances, but also cultural desirability and undesirability. While the integration of Turkishness into a global constellation of racial power relations since the late Ottoman period revolves around global hierarchies, the resulting racial discourses around the whiteness and modernity of Turks create locally manufactured cultural hierarchies that shape life chances. In the neoliberal economy of contemporary Turkey, rewards for physical signs of whiteness are numerous. Westernization done in the name of fighting against racial stereotypes, which denigrated Turks as savage, terrible Turks, resulted in adoption of a set of values which included racial inferiority and superiority. The links between race and modernity bring physical appearance and cultural capital together in undeniable ways. Difficulties against the study of race and racism cut out important tasks for critical race scholarship. The first task has to do with uncovering the silent operation of new racism across different contexts while maintaining a degree of consistency to the concept of race. This requires a debate about the linkages between race and related concepts, such as ethnicity and nation, and identifying differences, and doing all of this without disregarding experiences outside Anglo American settings. Second, it is important to pay attention to the global nature of race and the fascination of racial discourses with immutability. Attention to power, especially in forms manifested in the global inequalities embedded in various modernizations, should bring a due emphasis on the central concern of race and racism in immutable classifications of inferior and superior. Global hierarchies emerging from colonial and post colonial encounters give race a common language. Thus, race scholarship can fight parochialism by pursuing this global agenda. However, and this is the third challenge, the emphasis on global linkages needs to be matched with due attention to the local and historical mutations of the concept. Racial discourses change across time and space. Shared origins do not necessarily result in similar destinations. The Turkish case has a lot to teach us. The contemporary manifestations of race operate silently and illustrate the difficulty of pinpointing such a mutable concept. This is different from the overt manifestations of racial superiority and inferiority. Therefore, the task of identifying the silent operation of racial discourses remains ever more important. The formation of racial vocabularies in Turkish identity has taken place in a context of global connections, both in the sense of flows of old school race science and in terms of circulating images in global popular culture. Finally, race in the Turkish context emerged intertwined with the historically formed local concerns with modernization. While racial discourses in Turkey are continuously fed with global flows, race science in early Republican era and global culture today, they mix and match with the particular agendas of the local setting. Bravo, bravo to Murat Ergin for this incredible book. There are some things I dislike about it, of course. I dislike that he waited until the very end to bring up the Afro Turks. I would really like to know what the Republicans were, the creators of the modern nation state of Turkey, how they were talking about the small but noticeable population of people with African descent in Turkey. Another thing that I disliked is, this book feels like it was written for people who are very resistant or confrontational towards the idea of even studying race, racism, white supremacy, critical race theory in the context of Turkey. And because this book is written feeling like it's writing for an audience that is fighting against the author, it comes across as overly, not that it's a bad thing, but overly academic, overly pedantic, overly like justifying in its claims when it doesn't have to be. If this guy knew he was writing this book to me, Simon Hill Keeps a Trail, a black man who's been to Turkey, acknowledges white supremacy, acknowledges anti-blackness as a fabric of Turkish society, et cetera, this book might have been written much differently. But it's written for the academics, it's written for the Turks, it's written for mostly white folks who, are very unaware of this concept and have to be convinced of its even existing, that this book even deserved to be written. So that's one of the frustrating things. Another thing that I wish that this book covered was that, the Turks, once again, have a storied history with black people. Before the white man showed up and told them, hey, white people are the best and white people are inventing modernity, you guys are yellow, and then sailed off while they snickered to themselves, haha, terrible Turk. And then the Turks are over there saying, no, no, wait, don't leave us. We are white. We are white. Before the Turks started doing that, they knew black people. So because of the physical characteristics that distinguish black people from Turks and the Arabs and stuff like that, why didn't he cover how the Ottomans thought of black people as well? That would have been very important. It seems like this book sort of picks up in the middle of when the Ottomans and Europeans were like really meeting together, when the Ottomans were like the sick man of Europe, and they act like the Ottoman slave trade with African bodies didn't happen. I felt like that would have been very important for the context of talking about, is the Turk a white man? I also dislike how in this book it's not included the story of the Turkish man who went to the United States Supreme Court to file a claim that he wanted to be white. I wish that was carried more in depth. I don't remember if that was in the introduction or chapter one of this book, but I wish that was included, as part of the history of Turks. Like, it would have been very interesting if he made this book international. This book is only in the Turkish context. It's only in the Turkish context. So he's talking about how race was developed within the nation in and of itself. But I thought it would have been very interesting to cover how Turks viewed whiteness in Germany, how Turks viewed whiteness in America. There's a little bit of that with the Turkish girl who talked about she went to America to study and the white folks couldn't believe that she was Turkish because she looks like Katie. She looks like Karen. You get what I'm saying? But let's talk about the Turks in Germany. This book is fairly good, a bit more academic than I thought it would be. A very difficult read, but I'm very glad that I finally checked this off of my to-do reading list. This has been on my reading list for well over like 2 years. 2 years. So I'm glad I finally got it done. I'm knocking out books that I really want to read. I got a whole library that I'm going to be reading on stream. I'm trying to hit at least 10 books before the end of the year. So we're on track. We finished up part 2, book 2 of our book react series. Go check out the series Cyber Racism by Jay Daniels. Go check out this one from beginning to end. And the next book on my list is one that my wife selected. My wife recommended a book for me, so it's called Hood. I don't know anything about it, but we're going to be reading that and reacting to that as well. And I hope y'all enjoy it. My name is Simon Hill. Y'all be easy out there. Stay blessed and peace.